addition to their spiritual duties. The clergy worked for governments, for example, in a variety of ways. They were diplomats, they were secretaries, they labored in government ministries. And a second feature of this second major problem that caused structural issues was the increasing degree of secular control over church matters, beginning already in the 15th century. The third major problem faced by the church on the eve of the Reformation involved the intense debates that took place about where is authority located in the church hierarchy. The debates involved internal power struggles at the highest levels of the church. And all of these debates very often damaged the reputation of the papal office and split the Catholic Church in various parts. But a considerable amount of recent research has also altered this picture of the late medieval church. It's no longer seen as simply a decadent, corrupt institution filled with discontented lay people yearning for something better. The first and most important cluster of evidence that shows this altered view is the fact that there was a huge amount of support for clerical activities in the early Reformation era. Extraordinary amounts of money were given for the building, renovation, and decoration of churches throughout the late Middle Ages. There's a second piece of evidence. There was extensive lay and civic support for preaching. Both the financial investment and the support of preaching suggest approval and embracing the teachings and practices of late medieval Catholicism by many people. A third cluster of evidence shows an unprecedented proliferation of lay piety and devotion. People were devoted almost to the extreme. The invention of printing in the 1450s played an important part in this expansion of lay piety by 1500. Thousands of printed devotional treatises were published. There were collections of saints' lives. There were prayer sheets. There were large numbers of so-called books of hours. The vernacular Bible was not rejected. At least 22 editions were published in Germany by 1522 of parts of the Bible in German. And another 13 vernacular editions in German were printed of the Sunday Gospel and epistle readings. There were also printed editions of the Bible or parts of the Bible in French, Italian, English, Spanish, and Czech. All of this printing had an enormous impact on the piety of people during this period. A fourth cluster of evidence is expressed in a mixed lay and clerical movement that began in the Netherlands in the 1380s. It later spread to Germany and into northern France. It's called the modern devotion. Members called the brothers and sisters of the common life came together to cultivate the life of the soul, even though they did not take formal clerical vows. This was clearly not a society seeking to change its religious orientation. And the final cluster of evidence indicating the vitality of the church can be seen in the acknowledgement of its shortcomings, abuses, and problems by large numbers of people. There were widespread calls for reform, and those widespread calls for reform were themselves a sign of vitality, not a resignation about decadence. One example, the internal reform undertaken in some of the monastic orders, including Luther's Augustinians. Well, in the monastery, Luther threw himself wholeheartedly into efforts to achieve salvation. As he later put it, quote, "I tortured myself with prayers, fasting, vigils, and freezing. The frost alone might have killed me." And he also wrote, "I almost fasted myself to death, for again and again I went for 3 days without taking a drop of water or a morsel of food. I was very serious about it." His rigorous self-examination only heightened his uncertainty regarding personal salvation. Luther's Reformation breakthrough, as later historians have designated it, delivered him from what he called this monster of uncertainty. Luther's intense biblical study led to a huge shift regarding the righteousness of God that exploded the late medieval understanding of Christianity and, quote, changed the course of world history, according to the modern German theologian Bernd Hahn. In contrast to the medieval belief in the efficacy of good works for salvation, Luther asserted that salvation is received from God, not achieved by us. Moreover, salvation is not the goal of life, but life's foundation, as he put it. As Luther emphasized, we do not become righteous by doing righteous deeds, but having been made righteous, we do righteous deeds. Justification by grace alone through faith was a paradigmatic shift almost without parallel in the history of Christianity. Well, the first hint of what was to come occurred near the end of Luther's obscurity. In September 1517, he wrote a set of theses called A Disputation Against Scholastic Theology. He condemned theologians' reliance on the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He emphasized the study of Scripture, and he expressed his love for certain passages in the writings of St. Augustine. But these theses did not find a popular audience, and as an author, Luther remained invisible. His critique of the sacrament of penance and the related practice of indulgences, though, soon followed with the 95 Theses on October 31st, 1517, which he officially called Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. Now, there's been a huge amount of debate in recent years about whether the theses were actually posted on the doors of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. The most important event on October 31st, 1517, however, was not posting of the theses, but mailing them to Luther's superior, Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz. They quickly sparked an academic uproar. The Roman establishment realized that Luther's criticism of indulgences and their power undermined church and especially papal authority. Pope Leo X's personal theologian, Sylvester Mazzolini Prierius, wrote the following to Luther, quote, "He who says in regard to indulgences that the Roman Church cannot do what she has actually done is a heretic." Yet most scholars now agree that the theses were not designed as a protest. Luther showed the required deference to church authorities by mailing the theses off. And he was actually surprised about how quickly the theses were distributed. Despite the opening announcement in the 95 Theses, a public disputation or debate was never held. Although a German translation was made at Nuremberg, Luther viewed it as inappropriate for a German-speaking readership. Instead, he published his Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, which was reprinted over 20 times, making Luther overnight a best-selling author. The theses represented Luther's response to the sale of the so-called Peter's Indulgence. This plenary indulgence was proclaimed by Pope Leo X in 1516 to assist in building the Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Rome. It was offered by Archbishop Albrecht beginning in January 1517 and announced by the Dominican Johann Tetzel soon thereafter. Not the first in the German territories to see problems with indulgences, Luther had already questioned them in his lectures at Wittenberg about Romans in 1515 and 1516, and he'd also questioned indulgences in a sermon delivered at the Castle Church in January 1517. In the 95 Theses, he questioned indulgences based on Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, which says, quote, "Do penance, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Luther used an interpretation of that verse first proposed by Erasmus of Rotterdam in his 1516 annotations to the Greek text of the Bible. But Luther expanded the text meaning beyond the sacrament of penance to include the entire life of the Christian as one of continual penitence. His chief argument, introduced in Thesis 5, states that, quote, "The Pope neither desires nor is able to remit any penalties except those imposed by his own authority or that of the canon law." In other words, papal indulgences reached only as far as church penalties for sin and did not touch at all on God's punishments. Luther insisted that teaching Christians to support the poor was a good work, far superior to the purchase of indulgences. The true treasury of the church, as he wrote, was the gospel of the glory and grace of God. And he closed the 95 Theses by contrasting the false peace of indulgences to the preaching of the cross. Upon their receipt, Archbishop Albrecht suspected false teaching and submitted them to his theological faculty at Mainz and sent them to Rome. Soon, the debate over indulgences moved to broader issues of theology. Luther was excommunicated by the Pope and condemned as an outlaw of the empire by the Diet of Worms in 1521. Beginning in early November 1517, just after he supposedly posted the 95 Theses, Luther began to sign letters with the designation Eleutherios. This new name that he was signing his letters with carried a distinct message, for it expressed the mission of its bearer. Eleutherios in Greek means the free one, the one who had been liberated, and at the same time the one who would liberate. Ultimately, the liberator abandoned this Greek form of his name because it was incomprehensible to most people. He preserved, however, a reminder of the freedom that was at the heart of Reformed theology. The central TH in the Greek form of his name, Eleutherios, was carried over now by Luther into his family name, so that Martin Luther became Martin Luther, the name with which he became famous.